Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Jedan je od vodećih ekonomista na svijetu. Bio je ekonomski savjetnik američkom predsjedniku Ronaldu Reaganu. Nakon pada željezne zavjese, savjetovao je bivše komunističke države u tranziciji, uključujući i Jugoslaviju. Danas profesor na prestižnom Johns Hopkins Univerzitetu, Hanke govori za Al Jazeeru. So Professor Hanke, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. It's such a pleasure to have you on our program. You're quite familiar with the Balkan region. It's worth reminding our viewers that you were one of the key people who played a role on establishing Bosnia's post-war currency, the convertible mark. Now take us back to the mid-1990s. How was it like working in a war-torn, post-communist country where everyone had for years been relying and trusting the Deutsche Mark?
Well, let's go back a little before that. Let's go back to January of 1990. I was, at that time, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia still existed, everything. This was before the Civil War, and I was appointed as the chief advisor to the Markovic government, specifically Jiko Pregel was the vice prime minister in charge of economic reforms. This was not January 1990. So, and they had a tremendous inflation problem in Yugoslavia at that time. And I really did two things. One is that Pregel was the head of the Communist League in Yugoslavia. And I advised Pregel, or I indicated that if he would in some way bring down the league and eliminate the league, that I'd become his advisor. He asked me how to do that. I told him what to do. He did it. The league evaporated and I became his advisor. Okay. So that was step one, is getting rid of the Communist Party, the league. Mm-hmm. And I pleased to say that I had a hand in doing that. The second thing was more problematic. I was focused on getting rid of inflation in Yugoslavia, and I wrote a book that was published both in London in English and Serbo-Croatian in Belgrade. And that book laid out a plan for a currency board system. And the currency board system is one in which the local currency is issued. It's anchored by an anchor currency, and that anchor currency, the reserves being held are 100% of the local currency that it's anchoring. And the local currency and the anchor currency trade at a fixed exchange rate. So that was circulating. The Civil War broke out, as you know, and roughly in May of 1991. So that was the end of Yugoslavia. But in the peace agreement, the Dayton Agreement, one of the features of that was my proposal for a currency board. Article 6 of the Dayton Agreement mandated that Bosnia-Herzegovina would have to have a currency board for the first 6 years of its existence. Mm-hmm. And then that was agreed to, by the way. Milosevic signed that. And I found out from Ambassador Holbrooke was the key negotiator. I said, how in the world did that get into the Dayton Agreement, that currency board? And he said, well, the Milosevic and his people had read your book that had been published in Serbo-Croatian. Right. Yeah. They said they were familiar with it, so they signed. They agreed to it. So right. I went then to Sarajevo. This was late in 1997, and helped establish the currency board that still exists in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the local currency is a convertible marca. It is backed 100%. Originally, it was backed 100% by the Deutsche Mark. Now it's backed 100% by the euro, and it trades at a fixed exchange rate with the euro. So So basically, the convertible market is just a clone of the euro. It's the same as the euro.
Yeah.
Except it physically it doesn't look the same as the euro. No.
Right.
And the name is different.
Right.
So that has been one thing that was late 1990s, 1997, and then in 1999, I was the state counselor, part of the government in Montenegro, and Serbia. That was the rump Yugoslavia at that time was Montenegro and Serbia. And what did we do there? I was advising them on what to do with the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar. And I said the best thing to do it with it, get rid of it and replace it with the Deutschmark. So we did that in December of 1999 when I was a state counselor for Montenegro and the advisor for President Djukanovic. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of immediate Balkan story. There are other Balkan stories because in 1997 in July stopped the hyperinflation in Bulgaria when I was a chief economic advisor to President Stoyanov in Bulgaria. And Bulgaria has a currency board like the one in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it smashed the hyperinflation and it stabilized things in Bulgaria. And so that's a thumbnail sketch in a hurry of the Balkans. And for me, step one was getting rid of the Communist Party in Yugoslavia, the League. Step two were these currency reforms proposals. The original one was for all of Yugoslavia. We never did it because of the Civil War, but it came in kind of through the back door with the Dayton Agreement for the peace in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we established a currency board there in 97, and then we replaced the Yugoslav dinar with the Deutschmark in 1999 in Montenegro, which was the first step, by the way, for Montenegro to actually gain independence.
Right. Now, Professor, I wanted to ask you...
secede from the rump Yugoslavia.
Yeah. And now I wanted to ask you, Western advisors such as yourself and economic experts very firmly advised, former communist states to privatize their state-owned companies. Now, that made a lot of sense if a country was transitioning from a planned economy to a market economy. But why did all these privatization efforts go so horribly wrong? And why did it give birth to the oligarchs in Ukraine, in Russia, and to somewhat smaller scale oligarchs in the Balkans and in Central Europe?
Well, just backing up, of course, if you go back to the first term of President Ronald Reagan, I was his privatization guru. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Mrs. Hanke, who happens to be French, actually transported that French word. Privatization is a French word. It wasn't even in the English dictionary. Okay. We put it in the English dictionary because people were complaining that we were using a word in my speeches and so forth, with Mrs. Hanke was helping me with. She liked the word privatize. And of course, she assumed it was English too, but it was actually French. Mm-hmm, so that's one step. That was about 1981, 82. Mm-hmm. And then we go to Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia, I have a very extensive proposal for how Yugoslavia should have privatized. If they would have done what I recommended, and all the other Eastern European and post-communist countries, if they would have followed my approach, there wouldn't have been the oligarchs, there wouldn't have been the scandals. The whole thing would have been perfect. Because we in a nutshell, I was proposing to put all the old nationalized companies privatize them and put them into the social security systems of those post-communist countries. In fact, I have a long article that's coming out. It's a chapter in a book. I've seen the galley proofs for it. It'll be published in a few months, where I go through all this Yugoslav proposal that I had proposed, and that would have been great because we would have privatized the system and put it into the social security system. So all the residents of those countries, those individual people, they would have been owners. They would have been part owners in these newly privatized companies. So that was a basic idea. It never happened. Right. They used kind of a lot of ad hoc methods to privatize. Some of them worked very well, and some of them did not work well. I mean, particularly in Russia, how did the oligarchs get started? Well, it was a shares scheme that Yeltsin put in which the oligarchs put in money to support Yeltsin and the government, and they got shares in exchange. They got privatized shares in exchange.
Right, but if you look at the example of the Baltic States, I mean, how do you make sense of the fact that Baltic countries, which were part of the Soviet Union, made a much smoother transition from communism into the EU in about, what, 13 years, and joining NATO compared to Balkan states?
Well, the one reason for that is that I was an advisor. I was a state counselor in Lithuania, for example, in 1994. So that and what did they do? They put in a currency board in 1994. I designed it. I wrote the book on it, and that stabilized Lithuania and put them on the right track. Go back to June of 1992. And what currency was circulating in Estonia? The Russian ruble. They didn't even have their own currency. What we did, we established a currency board in June of 1992 and replaced the Russian ruble with the Estonian krone. So those two were the leading ones. Remember the dates: 1992, Estonia; 1994, Lithuania. So they were leading, especially Lithuania. Lithuania was very early in the process. So you have to remember these currency reforms are very important because stability might not be everything, but without stability, you have nothing. If things are unstable, you can't have any well-planned transition. There's a lot of instability and risk and so forth associated with it. Right. So the key necessary condition is to establish stability, and you do that by either establishing a currency board like the one in Bosnia, or doing what we did in Montenegro. You just get rid of the local currency completely and use some foreign currency. Exactly.
Now, allow me to move to some more, current and pressing issues. Now, you have advised numerous countries on managing inflation. Turkey is a major player in the Balkans, and you're very familiar with Turkey. How do you evaluate the current economic policies of the Turkish government, particularly in terms of their fiscal and monetary frameworks? And do you see any potential risks associated with these policies?
Well, what happened with the recent election of President Erdogan, he changed economic teams and he basically changed the whole model for running the monetary and fiscal arrangements. And as a result of that, inflation has started to come down, actually come down rather dramatically. And the reason that it's come down is because the growth rate in the money supply has started to be controlled. About a year ago, a little over a year ago, the rate of growth in the money supply was about 85% per year, and it's dropped down to 44% per year. So the money supply has come down. Now, what's happened to inflation? Inflation has also come down. If you look at the official inflation rate in Turkey, I'm just looking at my table here. In April of, let's say July of 2022, it was 82%, 89% in August, 87% in September, and so forth. It was up in the 80s. Now the official inflation rate has been cut in about half. It's about 44% right now. Actually, my measure, I measure it every day in Turkey, the inflation rate. I think the most accurate measure, it isn't the official rate now. The official rate is fallen in August down to 52%. My measure is about 30%. And my measure leads the official rate. So the official rate, I think, will keep falling in Turkey because the money supply is falling and slowing down. So it's always about the money supply. What's going on with the money supply? If the money supply is too high, you have hot inflation. If the money supply starts cooling down, inflation cools down, slows down. So that's what's going on in Turkey. But they still have a long way to go because their inflation target is 5%. Their actual official inflation, I said, is 52%. I think my measure using high frequency data is more accurate. It's about 30%. But both those numbers are way higher than the inflation target of 5%. And to hit the inflation target of 5%, they'd have to be growing the money supply about 12%. And what are they growing it at? They're still growing it at 44%. So the risk is, you ask about the risk. The risk is that they don't keep putting the brakes. If they stop putting the brakes on the money supply and don't keep it going down, the inflation will continue and they'll have inflation problems and the lira will be destabilized again. Right now, the Turkish lira is pretty stable.
So if you had the chance to advise the Turkish government when it comes to structural reforms to stabilize the lira and control inflation, what would it be?
It would be exactly what I did in Bulgaria in 1997, or exactly what I did in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1997, or what I did in Lithuania in 94, or Estonia in 92. A currency board. They should be issuing a lira. It should be fully backed by an anchor currency, let's say the US dollar. It should trade at a fixed exchange rate, the lira with the US dollar, and the anchor and reserves should be 100% of the lira that are being issued. And if you did that, the lira would be perfectly stable and it would be a clone of the US dollar. And if you didn't like the US dollar as the anchor, you could use the euro. If you didn't like the euro, you could use gold.
Right.
You could even have it. You could even have gold. I've laid all this out in a book I published and co-authored with Kurt Schuler. It's published in Turkish.
Right. I saw it. Yeah.
So and by the way, my good friend, the late Ghazi Ursel, was the governor of the central bank in Turkey from 1996 to 2001. And with Ursel, we came pretty close to actually changing the rules of the game and putting in a currency board. It never happened, but it came pretty close. And that's what they should do.
Now, Professor, I wanted to ask you, how have these recent geopolitical tensions, both regionally and globally, impacted Turkey's economic stability and growth prospects? And what do you make of all this criticism Turkey is facing, for trading with both Russia and Ukraine, with the US and China, with Israel and the Arab Gulf states?
Well, I think Turkey has been playing a pretty good geopolitical game. Erdogan has, and what does he want to do? He wants Turkey to be able to trade with everybody. Now he has put restrictions on Israel. That's one, but as far as the so-called South, the BRICS countries, and the West, led by the United States, he wants to do business with all of them. Why wouldn't you want to do business with people?
Mm-hmm. So do you think he sees himself as a modern day Tito, and then within the non-aligned movement?
Well, not exactly, because remember, if we get into Tito, the non-aligned thing is fine as long as you have open trade and so forth. But Tito was a communist and a socialist, and that's not the model in Turkey.
Right.
The Turkish model is basically a free enterprise operation, and as a result, by the way, I think Turkey, the more they have free enterprise, the better for Turkey, because I think Turkey is a country with a lot of potential. Right now, its potential growth it's in real terms, adjusted for inflation, real growth is a little over 3% in Turkey. I think they could raise that up if they deregulated more, got things more formalized in the form, and let the private sector expand. If they opened up the private sector even more in Turkey and got the government out of the way with Turkish red tape, I think they could get that potential up over 4%. Instead of 3%, they'd be up at 4%.
Now,
or,
as you move,
or maybe even a little bit higher. So if I was advising Turkey, it would be to get rid of Turkish red tape and push the government back into the corner. Let the private sector soar. The private sector is pretty strong in Turkey. The Turkish workforce is strong. Intellectual capital is strong. They just have a lot going for them that they should unleash. And the way to unleash it is to get the Turkish bureaucrats and regulations out of the way.
Right. And finally, in light of current global challenges such as geopolitical tensions, the supply chain disruptions, and the post-COVID recovery efforts, what is your outlook on global economic growth over the next 5 years? And are there any specific regions that you're particularly optimistic about?
Well, let's start with the negative. The negative, of course, is Europe. Talk about red tape. The European Union, the EU's got red tape around everything. So Europe is really in bad shape, and Europe has imposed lots of sanctions on Russia, and these have all backfired very badly. They're very, I think, ill-advised, bad policy. All the sanctions on Russia. Sanctions in general are a bad idea, and they have really hurt Europe. So the Europe has had two things going against it. These sanctions against Russia have all backfired very badly, and the EU bureaucracy just ties European enterprise up with more and more red tape. And if you look at the number of foreign listed companies on European stock exchanges, they're going down. Since 2007, they've gone down from about 13% of foreign of the listings were foreign, down to about 9%. In the U.S., on the other hand, the U.S. it shot up. It shot up from a number that was even lower than the EU listings as a percentage in 2007. It shot up to about 25%. So Europe is in trouble. I think China is in trouble because the money supply growth there is way lower than it should be. The growth rate in China to be consistent with their inflation target of 3%, my calculations, the growth rate should be about 12, 13%, and the growth rate in the money supply is much lower than that. So very low growth in China, and additional problems with overinvestment, as you know, in real estate. And they had a very bad COVID lockdown policy. So they have lots of problems in China. And China, depending on how you measure it, it's either the second biggest economy in the world or the first. So the U.S., by the way, is right now going into what I think will be a recession late this year. So we got secular problems in Europe as well as cyclical. We have a cyclical problem in China, and we have a cyclical problem in the U.S. So where are the bright spots? Well, it's really kind of hard to find them, to tell you the truth.
Right.
If you look for the bright spots, you're doing you end up looking for what's the best dirty shirt in the world, because they're all looking pretty dirty to me.
Right. Professor Hanke, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you, Arun. Great to be with you.